Welcome to Basically a Therapist, but without the degree. I'm Lauren Larson, and I'm so excited that you're here with me in episode 15. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. That would mean the world to me, and it would just really help me to get this podcast out there. So today we're going to be talking about boundaries with family. So we're going to be exploring, just the complexities and the dynamic around boundaries with extended family, parents, siblings, in-laws, etc. And although they're challenging, they're extremely important and actually essential to the health of the relationship, just like any other relationship in our life. We're going to be talking about some practical insights, some Bible verses to support that, and just some personal ideas as well. So let's get into it. So I first want to start off with understanding boundaries within a family dynamic. So I've talked about this before, and I'll probably say it again and again and again, but I want to define boundaries within the context of that family relationship, again, the in-laws, the parents, the siblings, the extended family, whatever, and explore, what they are and why they're necessary for healthy interactions. So boundaries refer to, again, personal limits, their guidelines, their fences, not walls, and just expectations that are established to protect emotional, physical, mental well-being. Okay. So these boundaries serve as healthy guidelines, parameters that define how individuals can treat you, how they engage with you, and what behaviors are acceptable and unacceptable. And this is important for a healthy relationship and healthy interactions within family for several reasons. So the first one is for respect and autonomy. So boundaries affirm and protect our individual autonomy, like who we are, our person. And they establish a framework, a foundation for mutual respect, because it allows you to acknowledge that everybody is entitled to their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own space, their own ideas, whatever. And so when we know where somebody stands, it helps us to respect that and show up in the way that they need. Another important reason is because it allows us to be protected emotionally. So boundaries help safeguard our emotional well-being by showing what is acceptable in terms of communication, conflict resolution, that's a big one, emotional expression. And they provide a sense of security and protection against the manipulation of others, emotional abuse, pressure from others, uncomfortable topics. I'm envisioning family dinners, like at the holidays, where those extremely uncomfortable conversations and situations come up because there's just no boundary about what is acceptable. And so anything and everything's just thrown out. It's also important to facilitate healthy communication with one another because it allows family relationships to have open and honest interactions with one another. Boundaries encourage us to express our needs, our wants, our preferences, our concerns in a constructive, respectful manner, leading to just better understanding and connection. I said this last week, but if you avoid these types of conversations, nobody's going to know where you stand and nobody's going to know how to interact with you. And so you are doing them a great disservice by ignoring and avoiding these kind of conversations and not giving family members the opportunity to show up in the way that you need them to. Boundaries also play a crucial, and I mean crucial, role in establishing guidelines for respectful disagreements. Because boundaries can help prevent conflict from escalating, yelling, screaming, abuse, and boundaries promote a more peaceful option. It's also important because boundaries allow individuals to maintain their sense of individuality and identity within the family unit, because they allow family members to pursue their own dreams and goals and interests and values while still allowing that person to feel like they belong and accepted. Because once again, we don't have to agree with somebody to validate them. And lastly, boundaries are important because they establish healthy roles and responsibilities within the family and prevent like an over-involvement or an enmeshment or a codependency. Boundaries allow people to take ownership of their own actions and decisions and words, which again promotes that autonomy, that independence. We are all our own person. We don't have to be something we're not. And I know that this can be challenging and that there are probably a lot of misconceptions around boundaries with family. And this can look like guilt, fear of conflict, people pleasing at our own expense, self-abandonment. And so let's talk about some of these challenges and misconceptions. Let's talk about guilt. One of the most prevalent, I would say, challenges is feeling the guilt of setting boundaries. And I said this last week too, is that a lot of people, they don't want to hurt people's feelings. But that comes from the belief that you are responsible for somebody else's feelings. You know, many people struggle with guilt when they want to assert boundaries with others because they feel like their needs or their well-being is maybe not as important, or fearing that they're going to disappoint or hurt somebody. And it stems from a sense of obligation to meet others' needs and expectations, and this fear of being perceived as selfish or uncaring, which comes from people pleasing. We also can struggle with a fear of conflict. Many people will avoid conversations and interactions and confrontation because they are terrified of conflict. And I've said this in a previous episode, multiple episodes, by the way. Go back and listen to them if you haven't already, but I did a series on conflict resolution. And I want to remind you that conflict in and of itself isn't wrong. It is the way that conflict is handled that makes it scary. And so if we are able to heal our own view of conflict, I think that would really help with our own fear of conflict. Because when we have this fear of conflict, instead of confronting, we can feel resentful. We can feel frustrated and just kind of shut down. It'll break down the communication, break down the relationship. And that's not what we're about. That's not what a healthy relationship is about. Because we want people, including family, to respect not only our yes, but our no. We also some of us have this desire to please others at our own expense, which kind of leads to like a self-abandonment. We think that prioritizing our own needs or well-being is selfish and inconsiderate. especially when it comes to family. This person can feel pressure to constantly fulfill the demands and needs of others while suppressing their own, just so they can avoid disappointing or upsetting family members. And this also can lead to resentment. It can lead to burnout. It can lead to like a loss of identity because you're so enmeshed, because you're so wrapped up in other people. And you kind of take on this identity of whoever that person needs you to be. Like, hey, my mom needs me to be this person, so I'm going to be this. Or my sister needs this, and so I'm going to do this. Or my dad needs this, and so I'm going to act this way. And so you're not acting true to yourself because you're trying to please each person and maybe put on a mask for each person. Another big one is enmeshment and codependency. Some people will blur the lines between themselves and somebody else, feeling responsible for their emotions, their behaviors, their thoughts, their whatever. And this can lead to over-involvement, an inability to assert your needs and preferences, constantly saving somebody else from their own consequences. And a lot of this can be due to just a lack of, role models or support when you were growing up. I didn't see a lot of boundary setting in my family when I was growing up. I was taught, and this isn't to make my parents look bad, but I was taught that people pleasing is the way to love. That is how I earn love. Don't go against the grain. Don't share your opinions. Don't anything. Do what the other people want at all times, and you'll constantly have their love. And that's not true. So I want to explore the importance of setting boundaries with family members and why it's so important to protect our emotional well-being and maintain our autonomy and help foster healthy communication. I've always used the analogy that boundaries are a fence, but they are also a protective barrier around our emotional health that can shield us from, negativity and toxicity and emotional harm. I think we can all think of that family relationship. So by clearly defining what behaviors and comments and interactions are acceptable or unacceptable, we create a space that is safe for ourselves to feel respected and valued and supported by our family. And this it preserves our mental and emotional well-being, which helps us with feeling resentment and frustration and emotional burnout. Because when we have boundaries and then we follow through with those boundaries, we have a confidence. We have the ability to know what belongs to us and what doesn't. And just because somebody can't fulfill our boundaries or meet our boundaries or respect our boundaries doesn't make them a bad person. I say this often, but really be careful on labeling people as good or bad, right or wrong. Their inability to respect your boundaries doesn't necessarily make them a bad person. And so it's up to you to hold the line and to decide how you're going to show up in the relationship if somebody can't be what you need them to be. Does it look like you walking away? Does it look like you saying something? Does it look like you distancing yourself? Does it look like you not interacting in that kind of conversation anymore? Like, what does that look like for you? We've talked about maintaining our autonomy, but it is so important to protect who we are, our right to make decisions, to express opinions, to pursue our own goals and dreams. We all have our own values. We all have our own beliefs. We all have our own preferences. And I've seen this a lot in politics too, where people feel the need to take on whatever political view that their family is. And it's not always just to keep the peace, and it's not necessary. Like, you can have your own political beliefs, but you can set a boundary around talking about it and discussing it with other people, because we know that there are people that don't know how to have a conversation without getting triggered or without blowing up or screaming or yelling when it comes to certain topics. And so have your own beliefs, stand firm in them, but you don't need to discuss them with anybody else. Don't pretend to be something you're not just to keep the peace. It's disrespectful to you. And again, boundaries serve a framework for healthy communication. Like, you're literally providing guidelines on how people can interact with you, how they can treat you, how they can show up for you. Because this creates clarity, it creates transparency and vulnerability and just a mutual understanding. Boundaries help reduce conflict. They help reduce misunderstandings and resentment. And that's important. I know a lot of people say how humble and how selfless Jesus was in his time on earth. And yes, that's true. And also, he had boundaries for himself. Mark 1:35-39 demonstrates that Jesus created an importance around self-care and boundaries by taking time alone to pray and recharge despite the demands of ministry, his disciples. He often went off to be alone. Luke 5:15-16, Jesus withdrew to lonely places to pray. And this just shows the importance of setting aside time to be alone and to renew yourself spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Matthew 26:36-46, in the Garden of Gethsemane. I can't say that word. Gethsemane? Whatever. Jesus set a boundary by expressing his own feelings and desires to his disciples, even though they couldn't fully understand or agree. How often did he do that? And then Jesus' interactions with his own family, Matthew 12:46-50, when Jesus' mother and brothers came to see him. He used this opportunity to teach about spiritual family bonds, emphasizing that those who do the will of God are his family. And Luke 2:41-52 says that even as a child, Jesus demonstrated a sense of independence and boundary setting when he stayed behind in Jerusalem to engage in debates and teachings and learnings with the teachers in the temple. And Paul, talking about boundaries in Ephesians 4:26-27, instructs believers to not let the sun go down while you're angry, and warns against giving the enemy a foothold into our relationships, into our anger. And this just shows the importance of addressing conflicts and setting boundaries to prevent further disconnection, harm, anger. And in Galatians 6:2, Paul encourages believers to carry each other's burdens, but he also emphasized personal responsibility and accountability. So there's a balance between carrying each other's burdens, taking care of each other's burdens. There's a beautiful balance between helping each other out and maintaining healthy boundaries. When it becomes a pattern, it's enabling. And then from Proverbs 25:17, seldom set foot in your neighbor's house, too much of you, and they will hate you. And this just shows the importance of respecting others' boundaries and not like imposing ourselves on their lives. So let's talk about the different types of boundaries that we can establish to promote healthy relationships with our family. So the first one is physical boundaries. This can involve setting limits on physical touch, personal space, privacy. This can include guidelines for appropriate displays of affection, respecting each other's personal space, and communicating preferences regarding physical contact. Emotional boundaries. This can involve establishing limits on sharing personal thoughts, feelings, vulnerabilities, opinions, as well as respecting others' emotional boundaries as well. By listening without judgment, like I said earlier, and supporting them while refraining from guilt tripping, emotional manipulation. Another one is time boundaries. This could include setting aside dedicated time for family activities, establishing routines for communications or visits, and respectfully just declining or rescheduling commitments. You don't have to constantly do what your parents ask you when you are an adult, especially when you're married, because the two leave their family and become one. And we'll get into boundaries with extended family in marriage, because that is a whole other ballgame. It can be. Again, communication boundaries. So this could include setting boundaries for respectful interactions and communications, expressing needs or concerns, establishing boundaries around sensitive topics, again, religion, politics, etc. Financial boundaries. This can include setting budgets, discussing financial goals or priorities, and respecting other people's financial autonomy and decision making. You don't have to understand what's going on in your parents' financial life. Parents, you don't have to understand what's going on in your adult children's financial life. And then there's boundaries around roles. This could include clarifying expectations on what roles or responsibilities you'll have in the home, delegating tasks and chores, and just kind of figuring out what each other is strong at and willing and wanting to do. Not that we do only what we want, but it can be taken into consideration. Okay, so I want to offer some practical strategies on communicating your boundaries effectively with your family. Number one, self-reflection and clarity. So before you have a conversation with anybody, make sure that you take time to really sit with yourself and decide what your needs are, what limits you want to set, what values you want to protect, and clarify what behaviors, interactions, or situations are acceptable or unacceptable for you. And then identify specific boundaries. So clearly define the boundaries you want to establish with your family. Be specific about what behaviors or actions you're comfortable or uncomfortable with, and communicate them assertively and respectfully, always. When you're doing this, make sure that you choose a good time. Avoid addressing sensitive topics during a heated moment or a public setting, and choose maybe a private environment where maybe nobody else is around or another family member is around, but not creating a situation where they may feel attacked or whatever. When you're setting boundaries, use I statements. Because again, this is based off of your needs, your feelings, not what they are doing. So I feel uncomfortable when, or I need blank. Not you do this and you need to stop, or you do this and I blah, blah, blah. We're not blaming. We are owning our needs and our feelings. And again, be assertive and firm when you're communicating your boundaries. Be confident, be firm, maintain eye contact. Use clear language. Don't beat around the bush. Don't take them along a journey. Get to the point and be clear. Clear and concise. And once you've set your boundaries, listen to them. Listen to where they're at. Listen to what they're feeling. You can validate their feelings. You can validate their perspective. But again, validation does not mean agreement, while still maintaining the importance of your boundary or boundaries. I've said this once and I will say it again. Set consequences and follow through. Follow through. Because there is no point in implementing a boundary if you do not plan on following through with it. Like, that just shows that you're not a person of your word. Your word doesn't mean anything when you say, hey, this sort of behavior, or this sort of interaction, or this type of language isn't going to be okay. And then you do nothing when it happens. So if you have come up with consequences for the violations of your boundaries, communicate them up front. Let them know. Hey, if this happens, we're going to be able to come for Christmas. Or if this continues to happen, we're going to need to create some distance. Whatever that is, enforce your boundary, and consistency is so important in this. And then if you need support, if you need guidance, find that. Find that in your wise, godly friends, maybe somebody at church, maybe a leader at church that can guide and support you in this matter, this topic, this situation. Family can be hard. And then lead by example. That is the best way, is by modeling boundary setting behavior for your family, by respecting them, their autonomy, their opinions, their values, their beliefs, their boundaries. Be assertive in your communication. Show them, teach them how to treat you by treating them the same way. And then again, boundaries don't need to be permanent. They can be changed. So you can put these boundaries in place and they might not work, or they need to be tweaked, and that's okay. Go back and have another conversation with them. Let them know. Be open to it. Reassess your boundaries from time to time. It doesn't make you wish-washy, because they could need to be adjusted based off of personal growth for yourself or the family member, circumstances, relationships, or whatever. Boundaries with family are just important. You are worth setting boundaries with your family. I know that there are a lot of people that struggle with that. But again, referring back to the last couple of weeks of the episodes, when we find our identity in God and don't need the approval of man, we can confidently set these boundaries. We can show up and know that we are worth being treated with respect, and vice versa. Your family is worth being treated with respect too. And so I would encourage you to sit down with God and really evaluate your family relationships and think about the relationships and the areas within those relationships that are causing stress, anxiety, or anything like that. And I actually created a freebie for you to download that will walk you through how to take an inventory. It's called the Boundary Inventory Guide, and it's available when you go to thelaurenlarson.com. I'll put it in the show notes, but it is a really great first step in establishing boundaries. And like always, include God in the process. Ask Him for His spirit of discernment. Seek His wisdom on how to show up in these relationships. And you won't be disappointed. Thank you so much for tuning into Basically a Therapist, but without the degree. Once again, like this episode and subscribe to this channel. And if you're really feeling this episode will encourage somebody that you know is struggling with boundaries in their family relationships, share it with them, encourage them. And I will see you next week. Bye. Yeah.